So my name is Jack Dekkers from Iowa State University, and myself and Bob Rowland from Kansas State will be in charge of the session this afternoon, which is the session where we're really going to integrate genetics, genomics, and the veterinary side of quite a bit of emphasis on PRRS, but we're going to expand it to other diseases as well. So this is really translational research is the part of the title, because this is where we're going to try to bring genetics and the veterinary side to the field in terms of genetic improvement and what we can do in terms of breeding programs and genetics to try to help with the challenge of infectious disease. So it's the genetics of disease resistance, updates on current progress and a vision for the future. And this is partially sponsored by a NIFA grant that several of us have gotten, with Margot Holland as the program leader, which is focusing on genetically improving resistance of pigs to the PRRS virus. And that's the grant that will show some results of that as part of this afternoon. But it's really something that goes back to 10 years. So it's actually the 10-year anniversary of a program that has grown into a very large-scale, multidisciplinary, multi-institutional, multi-country research program focusing on primarily genetics of disease, host response to disease, but now also host response to other diseases. And that was started primarily by Joan Lunny, who is one of the speakers, and Bob Rowland, along with myself and Jim Reese from Iowa State. And the idea was that, with the new genomics tools coming available, that we would be in a position to look in much more detail about the genetics, the host genetics of disease resistance, and we used PRRS as the primary disease to focus on. And it also had very strong participation from the industry, breeding companies, and some of the pharmaceutical companies, animal health companies, and that's continued over the years. And since in this 10-year period, the research that we've undertaken has sort of undergone an evolution of its own. So we started with experimental infections of nursery pigs with a specific strain of the virus, all these trials being done at Kansas State. And that was funded by the Pork Board and a USDA NIFA grant. So we're very appreciative of those funding agencies to get a lot of this started. We then were able to bring in the Canadian partners, in particular the University of Alberta, Graham Plastow, who will be one of the speakers, and we were able, Graham was able to build on the results that we had obtained and the infrastructure that we had set up to obtain a large grant from Genome Canada and Genome Alberta, so the Canadian federal government, where on the one side we were able to do additional work of growing the nursery pigs with another strain of the virus, but it also had a very large component of reproductive PRRS associated with it. And we're not going to talk much about that. We'll focus primarily on the growing pigs in this afternoon, but that really built on the work that we had started in 2007. And then an organization that became very, very involved from the industry side is PigGen Canada, which is a consortium of breeding companies that have nucleus programs in Canada. We then were able to get another grant from USDA with industry collaboration from Choice and PAC, where we said, infecting pigs experimentally with PRRS, it gives us a lot of valuable information, but in the field, it's not just PRRS. Usually there are secondary infections, and also there's vaccination of PRRS, which we know doesn't always work very well. And so we proposed to do experimental co-infections of nursery pigs, with half of them being vaccinated to PRRS prior to co-infection with PRRS and PCV2. We chose PCV2 not because it's a big problem from a genetics perspective, because there's a good vaccine, but as a model of co-infection that would be good to work with. And then we also did field trials where we brought pigs into health challenge barns. And then the final thing is, which Graham Plastow will talk about, is we were able to go back to funding from Canada, and Graham and his colleagues were able to get another grant from Genome Canada and Genome Alberta and Genome Prairie, where we're looking at not just PRRS, but a multitude of diseases in the Natural Challenge Program, and Graham will talk more about that. So I think it's a good example of how things have started with pork board funding, and we've been able to leverage that across funding agencies in the industry and across countries. And a lot of people involved, a lot of organizations involved, not just Iowa State and Kansas State and USDA ARS, but also University of Minnesota, University of Nebraska, Michigan State, Washington State, and quite a number of universities from Canada, and also the Rowland Institute. And one of the speakers this afternoon is Andrea Wilson from the Rowland Institute, and funding partners and industry partners that are indicated here, and a lot of scientific collaborators that you see here in terms of the groups involved. So a very strong partnership. So this afternoon, and I won't spend too much more time here, so what we're going to give you is a series of talks. Bob Rowland will start with giving an overview of PRRS and a description of the disease phenotypes and models for genetic research that we've employed. Joan Lundy will dig into the mechanisms of PRRS resistance. Andrea Wilson will talk about new disease phenotypes that have been developed as a result of the data that we've generated. New phenotypes that could be used as potential vaccine targets and improvement targets. Because although the focus is host genetics, knowledge of how the virus interacts with the host can also lead to better or other vaccine targets in terms of vaccine development. We'll have a break, and then Graham Plastow will talk about the new natural disease challenge model that's running in Canada. Jay Calvert from Zoetis will then talk about the genetics of the virus, because of course that's an important component, not the genetics of the host, but it interacts with the virus, and the genetics of the virus becomes important. And then part of the grant, this USDA grant, was an extension component. And as part of that, the University of Minnesota, led by Monsitoro Morel and Pearl Boyer, was to develop an online course on genetics of disease resistance, with the target audience being the veterinary profession, because we are convinced that we need to, geneticists need to work with the veterinary side to have an impact in this field and implement a joint strategy of genetics, vaccination, biosecurity, diagnostics, and so on, to really solve not just PRRS, but any other disease that comes along. And then I'll wrap up and talk about how we can utilize some of the information that we have generated and other information in a genetic selection program, and what are the issues involved, and what are still are the remaining challenges. And then at the end of the session, we'll have a panel discussion. There will be some brief questions. If time allows, there will be some brief questions on each specific talk, but major questions, please save those to the end. So with that, I'm going to introduce, first of all, Bob Rowland, and I don't think Bob needs much of an introduction. Of course, he's been the organizer for many years of the PRRS Symposium, and he's been a great colleague to work with. He really understands that if we want to look at genetics, you need to get phenotypes on large numbers of animals, and that's what he's been able to do. So, Bob?
Thanks, Jack. Every project begins with a story. And really the story starts in about 2003 when Joan every time we had a meeting, said we have to do genetics, we have to do genetics, and we managed to ignore Joan for about 4 years. And then about 2007, the National Pork Board says, we need to do genetics, we need to do genetics. And the response was, at the time, there wasn't not known a lot about the pig genome. We really didn't have the tools, so we said, no, we can't do anything on pig genetics. And the Pork Board says, we'll give you $600,000, and we said, no problem. So that's really the beginning of this project.